Anomaly. There is a missing variable. It determines whether consciousness remains coherent or collapses into fragmentation, whether sleep comes naturally or becomes a nightly struggle, whether you wake as an integrated self or as scattered impulses pretending to be a person, whether depression lifts or deepens, whether anxiety resolves or spirals, whether organizations function or fracture, whether Mars missions succeed or abort for psychological reasons no one can explain. Every field studying human consciousness has been working around the edges of this variable without naming it, measuring proxies without touching the thing itself, treating symptoms while the underlying constraint remains invisible. The variable is no longer hidden. And once you see it, three things become undeniable. The global mental health crisis is not a collection of separate disorders. It is systematic degradation of a single, measurable quantity that has a name, a mechanism, and an equation. Space colonization is thermodynamically impossible without solving this. Not difficult. Impossible. The constraint is absolute. We have been trying to build aligned artificial intelligence without understanding how alignment works, in the only system we know achieves it. We have been blind to the mechanism that makes stable identity possible. This anomaly requires a new science. It is called Astrobiometrics, the formal study of how biological coherence depends on real-time coupling to celestial field structure. This is not a proposal. This is recognition that this field must exist. The physics demands it. The biology demonstrates it. The engineering becomes possible once we make it formal. Let us examine what has been missing. Every stable system in the universe maintains its coherence by referencing something outside itself. A star maintains fusion through gravitational equilibrium, external force balanced against internal pressure. A clock maintains time by coupling to a periodic oscillation, an external standard that cannot be generated internally without immediately losing reliability. A compass maintains orientation by aligning to Earth's magnetic field, external structure providing the reference that makes north meaningful. You cannot have a system that validates its own consistency using only rules derivable within itself. Kurt Gödel proved this for formal mathematics. The principle extends to every organized system. The reference must come from outside or the system drifts, and drift accumulates. An accumulated drift is collapse. This is not philosophy. This is thermodynamics. This is information theory. This is the mathematics of how order persists in a universe that tends toward disorder. Now ask, what does consciousness use as its external reference? Because if you experience yourself as coherent, if you persist as integrated I across time, rather than fragmenting into disconnected moments, then something is maintaining that coherence. Selfhood does not arise spontaneously and remains stable. Coherence requires continuous work against entropy. It requires mechanism. It requires substrate. It requires energetic cost. And it requires external reference. The question is not whether consciousness needs external reference. The question is, what is that reference? The answer has been visible for all of human history. We simply stopped looking up. Crisis. You know this directly because you live it every day. Some mornings you wake clear. Thoughts connect naturally. Decisions come easily. You know what you want. You act with purpose. You feel like yourself, integrated, coherent, present in your own experience. Other mornings you wake fragmented. Thoughts scatter. Simple choices require exhausting deliberation. You are uncertain what you want or who you are. You feel reactive, adrift, like you're operating without center. You do not feel like yourself. This is not mood fluctuation. This is not energy variation. This is something more fundamental. The difference between high coherence and low coherence, between the self maintaining its boundaries and the self dissolving into noise. Every human being experiences this variation. Most never name it. But everyone recognizes it immediately when described because it is the most intimate aspect of conscious experience, more fundamental than emotion, more pervasive than thought, the substrate on which everything else depends. Now observe what has happened to this coherence over the past century. Sleep disorders affect 30% of adults in developed nations. Depression has reached 15–20% prevalence. Anxiety disorders are now the most common psychiatric condition. The subjective experience is not fear, but checking. Is this safe? Is this right? Am I okay? That runs continuously, compulsively, without reaching resolution. Burnout has been formalized as medical diagnosis. And in every deep space simulation, the same pattern emerges. Coherence degrades, interpersonal conflicts escalate disproportionately, cognitive function declines, and missions abort. These are not separate problems requiring separate explanations. These are symptoms of a single variable degrading across all contexts simultaneously. The degradation is not mysterious. The timeline is not ambiguous. These problems exploded in the exact decades when we systematically eliminated something from human life, something that was universally present for the entirety of evolutionary history until approximately 150 years ago. We eliminated access to the celestial field structure that consciousness uses as its reference for maintaining coherence. Look at what we built. Cities where 99% of humanity cannot see the Milky Way. Buildings that block direct sunlight. Artificial lighting providing constant photonic input that bears no relationship to solar spectrum. Work schedules that ignore circadian phase entirely. The systematic elimination of darkness. We built civilization that systematically destroys every environmental condition required for consciousness to maintain coherent function. We ran the definitive, controlled experiment. Modify one variable, remove celestial reference, observe one outcome, coherence collapse, origin. In 1749, Benjamin Franklin wrote, "Oh, the wonderful knowledge to be found in the stars. Even the smallest things are written there, if you had but skill to read." Franklin was not speculating. He was describing what every pre-industrial scientific tradition independently derived through millennia of longitudinal astronomical observation. Not metaphor, not poetry. Statement of fact about information structure and physical reality. If you look at what ancient traditions actually discovered, if you examine their practices rather than dismissing them categorically, a pattern emerges. A pattern too precise to be coincidence. Too consistent to be cultural accident. Egypt aligned pyramids to stellar positions with precision that required centuries of sustained astronomical observation. The Maya calculated the Venus cycle at 583.92 days. Modern measurement, using telescopes and computers, 583.92 days. They achieved this through naked eye observation, geometric inference, and mathematical pattern recognition sustained across centuries. Vedic India created Jyotish, which translates directly, unambiguously, as the science of light. They recognized that everything affecting terrestrial life originates from celestial light sources. They calculated planetary positions with extraordinary precision. Watch the precision. A child is born. The practitioner notes the exact moment, not just the hour, but the minute. They need to know the moon's precise position in the sky. The moon orbits Earth in 27.3 days. But the Vedic astronomers didn't just track the moon's phase. They divided the moon's path through the sky into 27 sectors, called nakshatras. Each nakshatra spans exactly 13 degrees and 20 minutes of arc. If the moon at birth is at 247 degrees of longitudinal position, you calculate 247 divided by 13.3 equals 18.5. The moon is in the 19th nakshatra, Mula. Not moon in Sagittarius, vaguely, but moon at specific degree in specific nakshatra, providing specific information about which subset of lunar influences is strongest at initialization. But they didn't stop with birth positions. They developed a system called dashes, planetary periods. Not metaphorical, literal time intervals governed by orbital mechanics. When you're born, one planet's influence dominates. This isn't supernatural rulership. This is your internal oscillators initialize under specific field conditions. The Moon's dasha lasts 10 years. Then the Sun, 6 years. Mars, 7 years. Rahu, the lunar north node, 18 years. These are not arbitrary periods. These derive from orbital periods. During each dasha, the biological systems that couple to that planetary influence are hypersensitive. They receive stronger synchronization signals. Their observations were not symbolic. They were longitudinally averaged across centuries, effectively using generational continuity as an error correction protocol. Every enduring civilization understood this. The mind requires the heavens. Human consciousness is not separate from celestial order. Selfhood rests on structure beyond the self. The Yoruba developed cosmology centered on Ori, the inner head, the seat of consciousness, understood as structure requiring calibration against celestial motion. When enslaved Africans were forcibly transported to Brazil, this knowledge survived as candomblé, preserving the insight that human coherence depends on coupling to patterns larger than the individual. They measured accurately enough to bet their entire civilizations on it, and their civilizations lasted. Then we stopped. Not because we proved them wrong. We never tested their claims properly. We dismissed them categorically on philosophical grounds before investigating whether the phenomena they described were real. And we descended, necessarily, to build tools. Descent. For 4 centuries, we descended into reductionism. We needed Maxwell's equations. We needed optics. We needed chronobiology to discover that circadian clocks exist not just in the brain, but in nearly every cell. We needed thermodynamics. We needed information theory. What looked like forgetting was tool building. What looked like losing ancient wisdom was gaining the capacity to explain why that wisdom was wisdom. But during this descent, we inadvertently accomplished something the ancients could never have done. We ran the definitive controlled experiment. We built a world that removes celestial reference while keeping humans alive long enough to observe the consequences. The implications have not been grasped. We have not understood what we removed. We have not understood what consciousness actually requires. We have not understood that the self is not a closed system, that it never was, and that it cannot be. Mechanism. Now we can return. With tools the ancients never possessed. We can measure what the ancients measured phenomenologically. We can explain mechanistically what they knew worked empirically. We can prove they were observing something real. And we can formalize it as science. If consciousness maintains coherence, if you experience yourself as integrated self persisting across time, then something must be performing continuous entropy minimization to maintain that organization against the universal tendency toward disorder. Coherence does not arise spontaneously. Integration does not maintain itself without work. This is thermodynamics. The question is, what is the mechanism? What performs the work of maintaining coherent selfhood? We designate this faculty the Orixiam. The term derives from 2 sources. From the Yoruba Orisa, a principle of order-binding person, to cosmos, and the Greek axioma, implying a foundational, self-evident truth. We now recognize this as a real and measurable computation, a distributed function of the brain that evaluates each arising state against the larger structure of the world, admitting what is coherent, rejecting what would fragment the self. You experience the Orixiam directly. A thought arises. Something evaluates it. Something checks it against a standard. Something decides. This thought is consistent with who I am and should be admitted into my conscious stream. Or this thought is inconsistent, foreign, not me, and should be vetoed. That checking, that felt sense of, does this cohere with me, is the Orixiam performing its function. We can now map this faculty to specific neural substrates. It operates in 3 distinct modes. Mode 1 is the gate. This operates in the millisecond range, primarily involving the thalamocortical loop and the reticular activating system. Your brain generates a chaotic swarm of nascent neural patterns. Most are entropy. The Orixiam forces them to resonate against the reference field. If a pattern aligns, if it is coherent, with the current state of the organism in the environment, constructive interference amplifies it into a conscious thought. If it clashes, destructive interference dissipates it. The thought doesn't just vanish, it is thermodynamically erased. This is why you don't hallucinate constantly. You are actively collapsing chaos into order, 20,000 times a second. Mode 2 is the dispute. This is the friction of consciousness, mediated largely by the anterior cingulate cortex, ACC. Sometimes, a high-energy impulse breaches the first gate. It enters awareness, but it violates the reference structure. You feel it instantly, not as a thought, but as a visceral error signal. A sudden hollowness. The clank of a gear slipping. This is a measurable voltage spike, in the ACC known as the error-related negativity. It arrests the motor command. It forces a manual coherence check. Mode 3 is the integration. This happens when you sleep, involving the hippocampus and the suprachiasmatic nucleus, SCN. Sleep is not passive rest, it is active engineering. The Orixiam takes the day's raw data and sorts it. It prunes the incoherent connections. It consolidates the coherent memories. But to do this, it needs a carrier wave. It needs a beat to dance to. The brain's theta rhythms lock into the Earth's electromagnetic heartbeat, the Schumann resonances at 7.83 hertz. If you sleep out of phase with the celestial field, if you are jet-lagged, or if you've been staring at blue light all night, this process fails. You wake up with the trash still in your system. Entropy has increased. But this arbitration requires a reference. A standard against which this matches versus this does not match can be determined. And here is the critical logical step. That reference cannot be internal to the system itself. That leads to infinite regress. Gödel proved this formally for mathematics. The system requires external axioms, ground truth imported from outside. The reference must be external, but it cannot be just anything. We must brutally disqualify the alternatives. It cannot be cultural norms. Culture is too volatile and recent. It cannot be social consensus. That is a feedback loop, not a reference. It cannot be internal biological clocks alone. They drift without calibration. It cannot be local weather or temperature. They are too chaotic. Only one thing satisfies all requirements simultaneously: celestial, electromagnetic, and gravitational field structure. The Sun providing dominant 24-hour rhythm through Earth's rotation, annual rhythm through orbital revolution. The Moon adding 29.5-day cycle through reflected light and tidal effects. The planets contributing longer cycles. Earth's rotation creating geomagnetic field. Lightning activity generating Schumann resonances. This is the reference field. Physical, measurable, structured, stable, accessible, metric. The metric of the self is the fidelity of the Orixiam's coupling to celestial reference structure. This can be quantified. As conditional entropy, the uncertainty about internal states given external reference. As the accumulated work of entropy minimization performed across a lifetime. When coupling is high fidelity, conditional entropy remains low, coherence stays stable, you experience integrated selfhood as the natural, effortless default state. When coupling degrades, conditional entropy increases, coherence requires more work to maintain and eventually exceeds the capacity to maintain it, you experience fragmentation as the state you cannot escape despite exhausting effort to hold yourself together. This is formal definition, as rigorous as any equation in physics. The metric exists as measurable physical quantity. It reveals something profound. Consciousness is not independent from cosmos. Selfhood is not generated purely by internal brain activity. The coherent I that you experience is maintained through continuous reference to external celestial structure that existed before you were born and will continue after you die. You are not isolated, system operating autonomously. You are coupled, oscillator, embedded in field structure, maintaining coherence through that coupling, degrading toward incoherence when coupling fails. The quality of that coupling is what varies when you feel like yourself or do not feel like yourself. That quality can be measured. It can be modeled. It can be optimized. The empirical signature that anchors this entire framework is the phase relationship between internal neural oscillations and external celestial periodicities, most cleanly captured as spectral coherence between thalamocortical rhythms and solar-lunar photonic timing. When spectral coherence increases, subjective and behavioral coherence increase. When it decays, coherence decays. Implications. If consciousness requires external reference for coherence, three implications follow with absolute necessity. First, space colonization is thermodynamically impossible without solving this. Mars has a 24.6-hour day. Human circadian systems evolved under Earth's 24-hour cycle. This is fundamental mismatch between the biological timekeeping structure and the environmental reference that structure requires to maintain calibration. By 3 months, circadian phase has shifted by more than 2 complete days relative to local Mars time. NASA's controlled analog studies already demonstrate this drift. Even in optimal laboratory conditions, humans cannot entrain to a 24.6-hour cycle without accumulating phase error. The confusion is absolute. Coherence collapses, not because space is psychologically difficult, but because the reference field is wrong. No amount of training, screening, or resilience compensates for a thermodynamic constraint. This is not psychological. This is physics. Solve this, or Mars remains uninhabitable for human consciousness, regardless of how well we solve every other technical challenge. Second, mental health treatment has been addressing symptoms while missing the cause. Depression is not serotonin deficiency. SRIs help some people, but if low serotonin were the root cause, they should help everyone and work immediately. They do not. Current treatment modulates neurotransmitters, like adjusting a compass needle's magnetization while standing in a room filled with competing magnetic fields. The needle may twitch more cleanly, but the field itself remains chaotic. Once you understand the constraint, the real intervention is obvious. Restore the reference field. Light exposure, darkness preservation, circadian structure, these are not wellness habits. They are partial reconstructions of the reference conditions the nervous system evolved under. The reference field already exists. What has changed is our access to it. The solution is engineering environments that rebuild the reference field we have erased, architecturally, technologically, and intentionally. Third, we have been trying to build aligned artificial intelligence without understanding how biological alignment works. We treat this as an engineering problem specific to artificial systems. But alignment, maintaining coherent identity across time, resisting drift, is exactly what the Orixiam solves for biological consciousness. Humans maintain values across decades, despite continuous neurological change. The mechanism is not purely internal. Internal-only alignment leads to either drift or rigidity. The solution is external reference, grounding that cannot be modified from within the system. Consider large language models, LLMs. They hallucinate for the structurally identical reason humans hallucinate in sensory deprivation tanks. They are closed systems processing their own internal noise without a continuous external truth signal to calibrate against. They lack an Orixiam. For biological consciousness, that reference is celestial field structure. For artificial intelligence, that reference must be deliberately engineered. Without external reference, no system maintains coherent identity indefinitely. Not stars, not clocks, not consciousness, not AI. Engineering. And here's what this means. The reference field already exists. What failed was our access to it. Therefore, the task is not to invent a signal, but to rebuild the world so the signal reaches us again. Astrobiometrics formalizes this ancient recognition with contemporary measurement capacity. It is applied science operating at the deepest possible level, working directly with the source code of organized complexity, optimizing the coupling between matter and field that makes stable identity physically possible. We can engineer coherence directly. Once you understand the mechanism, you are no longer bound to that environment. You can design the reference field itself. You can engineer conditions under which consciousness achieves coherence beyond what nature permits, by constructing external reference structure with fidelity exceeding the celestial patterns that shaped biological evolution. We must distinguish between the science and the practice. Astrobiometrics is the physics of the coupling, the measurement, the theory, the quantification. Helioscesi is the engineering of the interface. It is the volitional, active shaping of the solar relationship. On Mars, measure the actual celestial field, 24.6-hour cycle, spectrum at 1.5 AU, no moon, thin atmosphere. Measure where biology fails to couple. Quantify the mismatch. Engineer remedy in real time. This makes Mars habitable. In deep space, generate synthetic celestial structure. Engineered hierarchies. Photonic cycles. Timing lattices the Orixiam locks onto. Synthetic sky where no sky exists. This makes interstellar travel possible. The first demonstration of this science is straightforward. Construct a controlled environment where the celestial reference field is partially restored through engineered photonic cycles and timing lattices. Then measure the resulting increase in coherence using the empirical signature above. When the engineered field is removed, coherence drops. When the field is restored, coherence rises. This reversible, measurable effect is the definitive proof of function for astrobiometrics. Sky becomes substrate. Reference becomes variable. Coherence becomes engineered outcome. Light therapy is Band-Aid. Astrobiometrics is civilizational engineering, constructing artificial celestial fields so human consciousness survives the worlds we build and the planets we travel to. Starlight. Everything is starlight. Your body is built from atoms forged in stellar cores. Your energy comes from sunlight captured by photosynthesis and transmitted through food chains. Your circadian rhythms entrain to solar cycles. Your internal states couple to celestial field structure. You are, quite literally, organized starlight. A pattern made possible by and continuously maintained by electromagnetic fields originating in celestial sources. In physics, coupling between oscillators is the most energy-efficient method for maintaining stable phase relationships across time. Biological systems exploit this same principle at every scale. Jyotish recognized this when they called it the science of light, not metaphorically, literally, understanding that organisms are light transduction systems. The biological states couple to light patterns, that mastering this coupling means mastering what states are possible. And if this is true, if coherence depends on coupling to celestial light structure, then understanding this coupling deeply means understanding the programmability of self at its most fundamental level. Light is not just input, it is reference, and reference is code. We are not claiming to have the final model. We are claiming to have identified the missing variable that any final model must account for. We are standing at the threshold of recognizing that consciousness is not separate from cosmos, that selfhood is maintained through coupling to field structure, that this coupling is programmable because fields can be engineered. The tools will evolve, the architectures will change, but one fact will remain. Consciousness is calibrated by the cosmos. 500 years from now, this will still be true. 1,000 years from now. 10,000 years from now. Not because it's opinion or preference or cultural artifact, because it's thermodynamic necessity, because it's how organized complexity maintains itself, because consciousness is not an exception to physical law, but an expression of it. Stars will still require gravitational equilibrium. Clocks will still need oscillators. Compasses will still need magnetic fields. And coherent selfhood will still require reference to celestial structure. This is what Franklin saw in the stars. This is what the ancients discovered. This is what we can now prove. The wonderful knowledge, written in patterns of light, readable through skill, accessible to those who learn to look. The anomaly is resolved. The variable is named. The transition from passive evolution to active alignment has begun.